to identify things and what you need to do when you identify things, and more particularly, what a spiritual director should be looking at. Now, not all, anybody here have a spiritual director? Yeah, because they're just really hard to come by. And we've only got 4 certified spiritual directors in the diocese, and we've got one working on their certificate in spiritual direction, and I've got 2 more years to go. Priests, by virtue of their ordination, are spiritual directors. Again, not all of them are good at homilies, and not all of them are good at spiritual direction, and some of us should not be directing souls, and some should be directing souls. So it's kind of, you're dealing with somebody's spirituality, somebody's supernatural end. And just a kind of a quick question here: what is our supernatural end? What's our natural end? Yeah. What's our supernatural end?
Eternity.
Eternity? Okay. So theologians will say that our supernatural end ties to our natural end, in a sense, in our regular lives, and that is the glory of God. Everything we do is for the glory of God. So that would be our supernatural end, right? The beatific vision, to see God in all of His glory and to worship Him in all His glory. If you go back to the Baltimore Catechism, everybody remember the Baltimore Catechism? Why were we created? To know Him, to love Him, serve Him in this, so that we can be with Him forever in the next. Sometimes the Baltimore Catechism really hits it pretty good. So yeah, it's the glorification of God. It's the glory of God. Everything we do is for the glory of God. Our sanctification is kind of secondary to that. And without that, we're not going to get to see the eternal beatific vision. So our spiritual life is directed towards that, as opposed to our physical life, although we'll try to show how the two tie together. Out of these, I'm going to spend more time on Rules 5 and Rule 13, because if you remember anything, those are the 2 rules that I want you to remember. And we'll go through these with some examples, and hopefully you can see the importance of those 2 rules. And then the daily examine. Anybody do an examine? Do you? Okay. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's not an examination of conscience per se, something you do before confession. This is something you do daily, several times a day. There's a particular examine if you do it at least 3 times during the day. And then there's a general examine that you do at the end of the day. So that we'll talk a little bit about that. So what's Christian prayer? This is straight out of the Catechism from the Little Flower. For me, prayer is a surge of the heart. It is a simple look toward heaven. It is a cry of recognition and of love. So it's conversation with the one that we love, and for us, it is a conversation with God. Anybody know what that is on the right? The picture? Anybody heard of Guido the Carthusian? I think Deacon Tim's had given you a class previously on Lectio Divina. Remember Lectio Divina? How we pray, meditate. Oratio, meditatio. Pray, meditate. What's the third one? It's read, it's meditate, it's pray, it's contemplate, and then make a resolve to do something. So mental prayer is filling the heart and mind with God, heart-to-heart expression of love and adoration. Again, this is straight out of the Catechism. And if you're interested in, if you've done any forum.org stuff, Timothy Gray has a great thing on Lectio Divina, very, very much worth listening to. And he will talk about Guido's ladder and the steps that you take. And just like, I mentioned 14 rules, you're not to go from rule 1 to 14, and the same thing with mental prayer. God carries you into a different stage. God carries you into a different stage, and you have to learn how to work with Cannonball moment. Anybody kind of can give a brief story of St. Ignatius Loyola and how he came about forming the Jesuits? He was a military man. Back in Spain in the 1500s, a lot of stuff happened in the 1500s, right? You had the Protestant Reformation, and you had St. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, you had Ignatius of Loyola. All of these were kind of in the Spanish realm, counter-Reformationists. And Ignatius was just this mighty kind of fighter guy that, not a very upper class, but he ended up getting hit with a cannonball in the leg. And as part of his convalescence, they had to re-break his leg, and he did not want any kind of thing to bite on. I guess what back in the day, you're a doctor, right? They didn't have hydrocodone and all that other stuff, so he did it, no anesthesia or whatever, to go ahead and break it. So I was convalescing in his sister's house, had nothing really to do but lay there and read, and the only book she had was a book on the life of Christ and the life of the saints. So he started reading it. And as he's reading this, he's going, wow, this is really a good way to live. And it gave him consolation. But then whenever he would go back to think about his normal life, pursuing this upper class lady, it wouldn't give him the consolation that the life of Christ and the life of the saints were. And this was a long period of time because the convalescence was long. And he continually walked after that with a limp, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And then the story just continues from there. And there he started the Jesuits. And so I'm thinking the Jesuits might be a little bit different back then than they are today to a degree. But thank God for the Jesuits. They are some of the best spiritual directors for us that are in the beginning stages of our spiritual life. All right, so Discernment of Spirits. If you've had the Catherine of Siena Institute Spiritual Gifts Inventory, I don't know if anybody's ever done the Spiritual Gifts Inventory where you identify your charisms. There's one in there called Discernment of the Spirits. Do not get that confused with this. This is kind of the original Discernment of Spirits, and it means something totally different. So it's the process by which we seek to distinguish between different kinds of spiritual stirrings in our hearts, identifying those that are from God and those that are not, in order to accept the ones that are from God and to reject the ones that are for not. So the whole the main purpose of this is determine what we are hearing. Is it from God or is it not from God? And then what do we do with it? And what do we not do with it at the same time? So I'm sure we all struggle with what's God's will for my life and how do we discern that will. This is not so much discerning the will as it is what is going on in my everyday life from moment to moment, and how do I discern whether I accept that or not accept that. It's really hard to do without a good spiritual director, or at least a spiritual friend. And there's three things that we do. First, we need to become aware of there's some stirring in our life that's going on that we need to be aware of, and then understand what that is. So both of those sometimes require a good spiritual friend to bounce things off of. Don't try to do this alone. Our religion is personal, but it's certainly not private. And you can get into a lot of trouble, just like personal interpretation of the Bible. St. Peter says there is no personal interpretation of Scripture. It's all from the Holy Spirit. So how is the Holy Spirit telling me to interpret? How is the Holy Spirit telling me to interpret this moment in my life? And just know that we can get it wrong ourselves and have really bad effects from getting it wrong, right? So luckily we can go back and do the next good thing. So before we get too far, but become aware, understand, and then to take action. Everything that we do, when we talk about Lectio Divina, it's not an official step of Lectio Divina, but it's what am I going to do with this information. Talked about a homily earlier before class started. I like to give a homily that, one, my wife has approved, first of all. And I've told people that my wife reads write it out, I'm more apt to chase a squirrel. And so I let her listen to it. I have it written out so that if there's something that you don't agree with, it's most likely because I didn't listen to her and do what she asked me to do. And that's got me in trouble in deacon class many times. And here's a little squirrel where I had to review my papers for a class for Sister Anna Marie. If you remember her, now in Scotland, miss her greatly. But she redlined a bunch of stuff, and I didn't change it. And then I turned it into Sister Anna Marie, and Sister Anna Marie redlined just about every single thing that my wife had redlined. And I'm like, oh, I guess I learned my lesson. So, so taking action is very important. The gospel is, the Bible is not something to be read. It's not only something to be read, but it's something to be done. Okay? We are justified. How are we justified? By faith. By faith. We're justified by faith, but we're saved by works done through faith. So we're actually saved by grace, number one, and that's pure gift from God. But that grace gives us the power to do works, and those works need to be done through faith in Jesus Christ. So it all goes together. So taking action is extremely important. Oh, this is a beautiful, beautiful statue. I don't know. Can you see what's going on here? What's going on? Who is that?
Saint Teresa.
Teresa of Avila. Yes, Teresa of Avila. What's happening here? You got an angel with a spear. Is that spear going in or coming out?
Going in.
That spear is coming out.
Well, who knows?
Yeah, that spear is coming out. And she has been pierced with the love of God. And the angel is pulling back. And she is still, the name of this statue is called Ecstasy. So look that up. It just gives me chills to think about, the angel has pierced her with God's love and pulling it out. And she's like, oh, can I only stay in that moment? Can I only stay there? And God doesn't necessarily want us to stay there sometimes. So we have to learn when to give up that moment and do something else or stay in the moment. And God will let us know that. So for since something will have to be explained about the spiritual delights the Lord gives there, and he's giving a spiritual delight to Teresa of Avila, the discussion will be more appropriate at that time so that understanding the nature of each thing, you will be able to strive for what is best. Yeah, beautiful statue. Ecstasy. All right, so essentially the rules apply to those who are striving to overcome sin, become better, and to progress in your spiritual life so that we can reach our final spiritual end, which is the glorification of God and the beatific vision. All right, St. Augustine, rule one. If we know about St. Augustine, he was quite the character. Have anybody read Confessions? St. Augustine's Confessions? No? Read it. Beautiful. And I think it's still the most read book, maybe. Sorry, I'm going to run over here. It's still the most read book in the history of books. I don't know how they determine that, but St. Augustine's Confessions. Get yourself a copy and read it. Fabulous, fabulous story. And so if
it's free with Kindle.
It's free, yeah, it's free with Kindle. Again, unless you're like me and you like to write in the books, because I'm making notes all over the place. So let's look briefly at St. Augustine, and if you can, is anybody a good reader here? I'll start off. I'll read the first one. All right, this is in our examples down in Rule 1. St. Augustine, in my youth, I burned to fill myself with evil things. I dared to run wild, indifferent, and dark ways of passion. And if we know about anything about Augustine, he's the most quoted saint in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And so he's gone from where I think I was sometimes, and maybe still sometimes, to this amazing saint. So this was the nature of my sickness. I was in torment, reproaching myself more bitterly than ever as I twisted and turned in my chain. I hoped that my chain might be broken once and for all, because it was only a small thing that held me now. And you, O Lord, never cease to watch over my heart. In your stern mercy, you lashed me with twin scourge of fear and shame, in case I should give way once more, and the worn and slender remnant of my chain should not be broken, but gain new strength and bind me all the faster. In my heart I kept saying, let it be now, let it be now. And merely by saying this, I was on the point of making the resolution. I was on the point of making it, but I did not succeed. Anybody remember his famous statement, Lord, give me chastity, just not right now? You know? And St. Ignatius was, in the bed while he's going back and forth and struggling between the good spirit and the bad spirit, between consolation and desolation, was going through the same sort of thing. So I stood on the brink of resolution, tried again, and came a little nearer to my goal, and then a little nearer still, so that I could almost reach out and grasp it. I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but you kind of get the idea of what's going on. It's a struggle. And we have these spiritual struggles, or we should have these spiritual struggles. We should be paying attention to what's going on. And then we'll get a little bit later, we'll talk about Rule 13 and what do we do about that. Okay? St. Augustine, one of the things he did that was so terrible, was that he and a bunch of his friends went into a pear orchard and didn't just take a pear and eat a pear. They took and destroyed, I don't know how many pears in this orchard and left them all over the place so that they were useless. And you're thinking, okay, a little prank. But this was something that really, truly bothered him all his life. And so it's that kind of attitude that I think God puts in us sometimes to go, where some people might think, especially in society today, that, hey, what's the big deal, okay? It's not that big of a deal, okay? But to make it that big of a deal and then to do something about it in your life, that kind of setup, and you'll see that in the book Confessions, how that moment changed his life, was one of the moments that changed his life. So let's look at Rule 1, and hopefully none of us are in here. In persons who are going from mortal sin to mortal sin, the enemy, and who's the enemy? Devil, Satan, is ordinary, the bad spirit, is ordinarily accustomed to propose apparent pleasures to them, leading them to imagine sensual delights and pleasures in order to hold them more and make them grow in their vices and sins. In these persons, the good spirit uses a contrary method, stinging and biting their consciences through the rational power of moral judgment. Anybody not had that happen? We have concupiscence, right? We have that tendency towards sin. And in that initial moment, the bad spirit is telling us, yeah, go ahead, it's okay, don't worry about it, go ahead. And then after we're done with that, we know that the good angel has been biting, stinging, prodding us to don't do that. It's the two devils here, one the good devil and the bad devil here, just going at it. And in Rule 1, we're going from mortal sin to mortal sin. And unless we can get out of that habit and really understand if you are going from mortal sin to mortal sin, and not just these little moments here and there that pull you back. Because even St. Teresa of Avila will say, you can get through the castle to maybe not to the seventh mansion rather, and come all the way back and do a mortal sin. Okay, but that's not bringing you all the way back necessarily. It's what do you do? What's that spirit in you telling you? If you're staying in that moment and staying in that pleasure, that's a whole different story. So we should feel the good spirit biting and stinging us. Okay? All right. Rule 2, St. Teresa, Ray Jardel. Interesting story there. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but you can read about that there. Let's do it. Why not? We've got time. So on your examples, Rule 2, St. Teresa Ray Jardel, I think that's how you say it. The enemy is leading you into error, but not in any way to make you fall into sin that would separate you from God our Lord. He tries rather to upset you and to interfere with your service of God and your peace of mind. We find ourselves sad without knowing why. We cannot pray with devotion, nor contemplate, or even speak or hear of the things of God without or with any interior taste or relish. So here we're seeing the opposite, right? We're seeing the good angel is working in us, and the bad angel is biting and stinging. So rules 1 and 2 are kind of the opposites. They kind of complement each other in that sense. So the enemy, as a rule, follows this course. He places obstacles and impediments in the way of those who love and begin to serve our Lord. And this is the first weapon he uses in his efforts to wound them. Okay, so anyway, that's what we're going to see in the second rule here. And we read the second rule in persons who are going on intensely, purifying their sins and rising from good to better in the service of God, our Lord. The method is contrary to that in the first rule. For then it is proper to the evil spirit to bite, sadden, and place obstacles, disquieting with false reasons, so that the person may not go forward. And it is proper to the good spirit to give courage and strength, consolations, tears, inspirations, and quiet, easing and taking away all obstacles, so that the person may go forward in doing good. And we've all experienced this, right? We're looking to do something good, and somebody's biting at you, going, "You can't do that. Why are you doing that?" They're not going to appreciate it. Every time you go do this good deed for this person, they never thank you. They never acknowledge that you're doing it. And so sometimes it discourages us, and that's what the devil is going to do. God will never discourage you. He may allow you to be discouraged, as we'll see in some of the later rules. He may allow it for a good reason, but he's not going to discourage you. He's not throwing that at you. So we know right off the bat that pure discouragement, that biting, that stinging of not doing that good deed, that's not from God. That's from Satan. And we'll talk about what to do in that instance in some of the later rules. Okay? All right. Any questions on the first two rules? Very. One of the things that anybody read Teresa of Avila by yourself without stopping? God bless you. I did a book study on Teresa of Avila's her autobiography, the book of her life, The Way of Perfection, and The Interior Castle, 3 books. And I've tried to do it by myself. I couldn't, so I decided selfishly I'm going to start a small group, and we're going to go through this together. It took over 6 months, once a week, and we made it through. And it was grueling. It was tough, but we made it through. And that's kind of how I would recommend. It's like trying to read the Bible all the way through from Genesis to Revelation. And, they don't do that. Father Mike Schmitz doesn't do it that way in the Bible in a year, although he's going through the catechism in that manner. But that's how it's laid out. But most spiritual directors, spiritual authors, theologians will tell you, don't just sit there and read that by yourself. Read and discuss, read and discuss. So just kind of hint. And someday I will actually do that study again, because it was very, 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 very enlightening for me. And again, it was selfish, but I think other people that were in the group got a lot out of that. So I would highly encourage you to do that. And there are study books that go along with it, study questions to help you through that, through those books. Okay? All right. Saint Therese, and I'm not going to. Saint Therese is an example of Rule 3, and I do want to read that because this is kind of cool and it's short. So on Rule 3, somebody else want to read that, Saint Therese, down at the bottom?
I'll take care of it.
All right, go ahead, Josh.
Descending the steps leading into the garden, she saw a little white hen under a tree, protecting her little chicks under her wings. Some were peeping out from under. Therese stopped, looking at them thoughtfully. After a while, I made a sign that we should go inside. I noticed her eyes were filled with tears, and I said, "You're crying." She put her hand over her eyes and cried even more. I can't explain it just now. I'm too deeply touched. That evening, in her cell, she told me the following, and there was a heavenly expression on her face. I cried when I thought how God used this image in order to teach us his tenderness toward us. All through my life, this is what he has done for me. He has hidden me totally under his wings. Earlier in the day, when I was leaving you, I was crying when going upstairs. I was unable to control myself any longer, and I hastened to our cell. My heart was overflowing with love and gratitude.
Excellent, excellent. Anybody relate to that? Yeah. Those are tears of love. That's just, I'm growing up as a guy, I never had feelings, and I don't know where the heck they came from over the last 5 years or so, but all of a sudden I've got never cried when Old Yeller died, but I can read a good story and just start to well up. Is anybody watching The Chosen last week? Was it episode 5? I think it was, when Jesus healed the woman with, and I'm tearing up now, healed the woman with the bleeding, and just that interchange back and forth. I mean, I was welling up. I was going, wow, that's from God. That's from God. That's rule 3. That's consolation. We're always not going to get that kind of consolation response out of it, but as Saint Therese, the little flower, was saying, that's something God was allowing her to see in that moment in her creation, and she took the time to see that. So that is rule the 3rd. I call it consolation when some interior movement is caused in the soul, through which the soul comes to be inflamed with love of its Creator and Lord, and consequently when it can love no created thing on the face of the earth, but only in the Creator of them all. Likewise, when it sheds tears that move to love of its Lord, whether out of sorrow for one's sins, or for the passion of Christ our Lord, or because of other things directly ordered to his service and praise, finally I call consolation every increase of hope, faith, and charity, in all interior joy that calls and attracts to heavenly things and to the salvation of one's soul, quieting it and giving it peace in its Creator and Lord. So consolations. Anybody ever been to Italy? Anybody ever been to Loreto? Been to Loreto? No? Oh, got to go to Loreto. Make that a point. Loreto is where the story goes that the house that Mary was born in, conceived in, born in, raised in, was transported from the Holy Land by angels to Loreto and rebuilt there, and there's a whole shrine around it. It's actually part of Vatican City, and there's actually 5 different times that you cross in and out of Vatican City, and there's a line on the road that says you're coming into Vatican City. If you need it, you can get your passport stamped every time you do that. So, St. Peter's, that's one, Vatican City there, St. Paul's outside the gate, St. Mary Major, Loreto, and there's one other, can't remember, but either way, you walk in, and before you get to the main chapel, you walk in on the left, and there's this small room. Oh, it's probably 1/3 of the size of this, and then paintings all along the wall, different size. And you walk into the room this way, and then I just kind of walked around and looked and got drawn to the back corner of that room. And on the wall in the back corner, very nondiscreet, there was a 8x11 painting of St. John presenting the Eucharist to Mary kneeling in front of her. Oh, that just struck me as something so profound. And the look on her face was like the look of Teresa of Avila in that statue Ecstasy. If I can get a hold of that painting without it being illegal, I want that. It's just amazing. So that's the kind of consolation that we're talking about here. And it's strictly, it can be physical, but remember, through all this, we're not talking about physical, although physical can lead to spiritual, and spiritual can lead and affect the physical. We're talking about spiritual. And so that's when a good spiritual director can say, I think what you're feeling really is physical consolation. Or no, you really are good. You really are feeling spiritual consolation. Okay, and we've had these moments, and we'll talk about how you identify those later as we get time. So rule 4 is obviously going to be the opposite, right? Rule 1 and 2 are opposites, and rule 3 and 4 are kind of the opposites. And let's see if we've got. So we won't read this, but we'll just talk about the rule just in the interest of time. But you can see in this rule, if we were talking about consolation in rule 3, what are we talking about in rule 4? Desolation. Yeah, we're talking about desolation, the opposite. Okay. So, rule the 4th is a spiritual desolation. I call desolation all the contrary to the 3rd rule. So right away, if we're not seeing all those consolations, we're probably dealing with desolation. So outside of the soul, that's a whole different thing. We can talk about that in a little bit with Rule 5. Disturbance in the soul, movement to low and earthly things, disquiet from various agitations and temptations. Talk about movement to lowly things. That's usually sensual things, food, addiction to, not an addiction, but an over desire for something earthly as opposed to something heavenly. Disquiet from agitations and temptations, moving to lack of confidence. The devil telling us you can't do this, why are you doing this? You committed to do the Bible in a year and you're not, you've already missed a whole week. You might as well just give up and wait till next year to start again. And what does Father Mike say? Don't give up, just go back. Put it on 1.5 speed in your podcast, which I do a lot. So sometimes even double speed. But just go back. Go back to where you were. And we'll talk about that again more in Rule 5. So lack of confidence, without hope, without love, finding oneself totally slothful, tepid, sad, and as if separated from one's Creator and Lord. For just as consolation is contrary to desolation, in the same way the thoughts that come from consolation are contrary to the thoughts that come from desolation. Have we ever committed to pray and we just don't feel like it that day? And we just don't. We just don't feel like it. I just feel bad. I just really do. I'm not getting anything out of it. Why am I doing this? And we'll talk about how to combat that, because it's very common. Every one of us has had that situation, and that's not from God. That's from the evil spirit biting and stinging at us, or not biting and stinging, actually working on us, because the good spirit is biting at us in that moment. No, keep going. It's okay. Okay. All right. All right. The 5th rule. Let's see. Rule the 5th. All right. Anybody want to read the experience from St. Ignatius? And we're using St. Ignatius here. Father Timothy Gallagher uses St. Ignatius because one, he's the one that wrote it, and two, his story is just so appropriate for what we're seeing here. So, Rule 5th? Go ahead. Speak loud, because I think you're on camera.
In the customary prayer, I felt great devotion, and from midway on, there was much of it clear, lucid, and as it were warm. Once in the chapel, as I saw some going down the stairway in a hurry, and at great pace, I did not feel ready to celebrate the Mass, and I returned to my room to prepare myself. Composing myself with tears, I turned to the chapel. During a part of the Mass, I felt great devotion, sometimes with movements to tears. During the other part, I struggled many times with what I would do to finish, because I was not finding what I was seeking. When the Mass was finished, and afterward in my room, I found myself totally alone, and without help of any kind, without power to relish any of my mediators, or any of the divine persons, but so remote and so separated from them, as if I had never felt anything of them, or never would feel anything again. Rather, thoughts came to me sometimes against Jesus, sometimes against another person, being so confused with different thoughts, such as to leave the house and rent a room so as to avoid the noise, or to attempt a fast, or to begin the Masses over again, or to put the altar on a higher floor. In nothing could I find peace, since I desired to finish at a time when my soul was in consolation and completely at rest.
Very good, very good. So he is in desolation at this point. We can see there's a lot going on in his head, and we have that too. And even in the chapel, okay, because the devil can bite and sting us in the chapel. How many times we go into adoration and we're being distracted by something? That happens all the time. It happens to the priest too. But they're there to say the Mass. St. Ignatius was there to say the Mass. Anybody heard of the term, I'll write it up here, ex opere operato? This is just a squirrel moment. Ex Anybody have a crack at what it might be?
Outside the experience?
Let's see, outside the experience. Okay, it is outside the experience, right? But that happens. This happens as a result, I guess. Ex opere operato, from the works worked. Okay, so we have a Roman Missal, we have vocal prayers, the liturgy, all of that, baptism and sacraments, and the reason they are effective is not because of the person, it's not because of me administering baptism and my state of grace or non-grace. It's because of the works worked. The sacraments work, the liturgy works, because of the works themselves being worked. It is Christ that is the mediator. I, as a deacon in baptism, witnessing a marriage, distributing communions, and working, doing the homily, and working in the person of Christ. The priest is doing the same thing. So they are effective because it is Christ working through the individual. And Christ can work through anybody. So St. Ignatius is experiencing this pull. Do I start the Mass over again? Do I do something different? Do I wait till I'm in consolation before I do the Mass? And we'll quickly see that no, the effectiveness is not because of our spiritual disposition. It's by the fact that Christ is working through us. The prayers work. The prayers work. The fact that we're praying works. We may not be getting anything out of it, but they work. And so let's look at the text of Rule 5. In time of desolation, never make a change, but be firm and constant in the proposals and determinations in which one was the day preceding such desolation, or in the determination in which one was in the preceding consolation. Because as in consolation the good spirit guides and counsels us more, so in desolation the bad spirit, with whose counsels we cannot find the way to a right decision. So when do we make good decisions? When should we make good decisions? Consolation or desolation? Consolation. I got a friend that I've been trying to get retire from the nuclear industry for years because he was such a pain, and if I can only get him out of the way, then it would make my job so much easier. And I'll call him Brian. And I said, Brian, when are you going to retire? Whenever I have 3 bad days in a row. What can I do to help? And but finally he did retire, and I said, I guess you had 3 bad days in a row. And he said, yes. And I thought to myself, I don't ever want to go out based on a bad day. I want to go out when I'm feeling good, that I've accomplished something, and I can make a plan for my life. Because when I go out in desolation, then I'm going, okay, now what am I going to do? So, and we'll see this again in the following rules, is that when we are in desolation, it's not a time to make a change. Now, we talked about movements in the soul and darkness of the soul. Okay, so let me ask you this: you look forward to going to prayer every day. You get up in the morning, you go to prayer, and you do your usual prayers that you said you were going to do. When you were in consolation, you made this commitment, and you do it. You love to do it, and you're just not getting anything out of it. You're just not getting anything out of it. You come back the next day, same thing. The next day, same thing. Are you, and it's continuing for who knows how long. Are you in desolation or consolation?
Desolation.
Neither. One thing that the rules of Ignatius doesn't take into account is the dark night of the soul and the dark night of the senses. Anybody familiar with that from Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, the dark night? That is totally different. It's kind of where Ignatius falls a little bit short, and Father Gallagher will explain it a little bit away. But in reality, you want to pray. You're doing everything you said you were going to do in consolation. In fact, we'll talk about in rules 6 and 7, what we do in these moments. But you've even increased. You said I said I was going to spend an hour, and I'm not getting anything, so I'm going to spend an hour and a half or an hour and 10, whatever it happens to be. And you're still not getting anything. That's the time to make a change. That's God probably telling you, okay, it's time. Okay, right now I'm at that moment with my spiritual director. I have this rule of life, I'll call it. There's a detailed list of prayers, when I do them. Time and place are very important. I just strongly recommend that you find a time and a place, preferably early in the morning. If you got to rise earlier. I get up at 3. I'm usually on the road by 3:30, here by 4. At work at 5. That's just me. It works for me. It could be at night, but it's got to be a dedicated time. And knowing that, for me, early in the morning, the devil is biting and stinging me to stay in bed. That, in the evening, it may be that the devil is biting and stinging you to go to bed. But dedicate that time, dedicate that location in particular. It can be in front of the Blessed Sacrament, like I said in this week's Deacon Corner, make a commitment. If you're doing this class, maybe not all of you go down, but before you come here, stop at the Blessed Sacrament, the Adoration Chapel, open it, genuflect on 2 knees, thank God for whatever it is you need to thank Him for. Get up, close the curtains, come to class. You do that and start making a habit of that, then your life will change. For me, if I don't go in front of the Blessed Sacrament before I go to work, I know my day is going to be different. A lot of times it's because I make it different. But anyway, that time of the dark night that Mother Saint Teresa of Calcutta went through for 20 years? Dark night of the soul, where she just wasn't getting anything out, but she never stopped. Okay, she may have changed what she did and changed her spiritual plan, but she still did it. Okay, so that's a whole different thing. Sometimes it's not desolation or consolation, and that's where we need to talk to somebody, and that's Rule of 13, which we will talk about later. Okay? All right. Rule of 6, although in desolation we should not change our first proposals, it is very advantageous to change ourselves intensely against the desolation itself. So we're not fighting things that we did in consolation, we're fighting the desolation. As by insisting more upon prayer, meditation, upon much examination, and upon extending ourselves in some suitable way of doing penance. So that's what Rule of 6 is telling us, is, hey, fight the desolation. And what are the 2 ways that we can combat something? 2 common ways, begin with an F. Each one begins with an F. Fight or flight. Fight or flight. And there's certain vices. We talk about the 7 deadly sins, and there's some of them we want to fight, and some of them we want to flee against. What would one that we would want to flee and not fight? Lust. Yeah, we don't want to fight it. We're going to lose. We want to flee from that. Okay? Others we want to fight against. And we can go through that later maybe if we have time, but those are kind of the 2 things, fight or flight against the desolation. And one of the things he does say that if you've made this plan and the devil is biting and stinging at you, and you've committed to an hour, commit to an hour and 10. Eventually, that's going to make the bad spirit so mad that he's going to flee. You can't stand that when you fight against him, because we have God on our side, right? Don't tell the bad spirit how big your problems are. Tell him how big your God is, kind of thing. Okay. So, and then there are examples for Rule 6 that you can read. The story of Ray is really something that we all can relate to. Making a commitment to do something, going to daily mass, 1 additional time a week, and then something happens and you just don't get there. you're tired, you come home from work, you're committed to pray at night, you sit down in front of the computer, and all of a sudden you're surfing from here to there to here to there, and you've not committed, not done the prayers that you said you were going to commit to when you were in consolation, and you say, okay, I'll get back to it again tomorrow, and then you don't, and then it just continues to snowball, and so we've got to fight that. That's something we've got to fight. And the minute that we find it, we stop, we go back, and we do what we said we were going to do. Anybody, well, there's a lot of us in here that are old enough to remember when the seatbelt law came into effect, right? Anybody, when the seatbelt law first came into effect, drive away with the seatbelt not on? Yeah. What I started doing right away is whenever I noticed that, I wouldn't say, oh, I'll wait, I'll remember next time. No, I grab the seatbelt, put it on. Whether it's at a stoplight or whether I'm in a safe place moving, put the seatbelt on. Pretty soon that becomes a reflective action that as soon as you get in the car, the seatbelt's coming on. So it's kind of the same thing here. As soon as we recognize something is from the bad spirit, we either fight or flee from it. And in the prayer instance, if we're truly in desolation, we fight it by saying, no, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it even better than I said I was going to do it the first time. Okay? So that's another example of how a physical can help your spiritual. Anybody get mad at the stoplight when the car in front of you doesn't go, and you start talking to somebody and yelling at somebody that can't hear you? Okay? Yeah. I had a big problem with patience, one of the virtues of patience. And I just imagined that there was a little child in the back seat every time I stopped. And that little child was going to repeat everything I said. And so I would stop myself from doing that. And, now I'm the person that makes people behind me mad. Because I got a hybrid, I got a Honda Insight, and I like to get my gas mileage. So I will set my cruise control at 10%, close to 10% above the limit. And I'll lock it in. And I don't care who comes up behind me, whether they're mad, they're honking, they're doing whatever. It's okay. And I go. And they honk at me going by, in a 40-mile-per-hour zone, they're going 55 blowing by me. And what? I don't care. I'm good with it. But that takes practice. And we've got to recognize that stuff right off the bat. Now, I can tell you, I got other vices that I'm really bad at. That I need to, and I recognized the other day, I need to take this and apply it the same way to my other vices. So a lot of times we rely on systems, computer programs, whatever, to save us instead of relying on God. Something I learned from one of the podcasts I listened to, which is a Byzantine podcast called What God Is Not. If you're interested in podcasts, it's a great one. What God Is Not. It's truly Byzantine. That my mother's side of the family growing up was Byzantine, Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic. Oddly enough, Sister Anna Marie's the same way. But anyway, that's kind of a squirrel there. I'll shoot out podcasts to you every once in a while because I love podcasts. Okay? So we'll go through example there. Rule the seventh, and we'll see how the Bible in a year thing kind of falls into rule the seventh. So let the one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers. Right away from the Bible, which book of the Bible comes to mind for anybody right off the bat? Job. Oh yeah, this is Job all over the place, right? So that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy. God didn't put him in that position, did he? God allowed Satan to do that. He talked to Satan and said, yeah, go ahead. You do your best with it. And he does that with us. But he also gives us the graces to fight it. And that's the story of Job. Whether it's a real story or not is irrelevant. Probably not, but that's okay. You guys are okay with that, right? With Job maybe not being an actual real person in biblical history. I mean, it's considered, in a lot of the Old Testament is considered as historical prose fiction. It's meant to tell a story. And so these stories were developed to help the Jewish people. Daniel may be the same way in many instances, but that's okay. That doesn't make it wrong. Because the Bible's not history book. And if you go through the Bible in a year, you'll get a lot of that understanding. It doesn't make it bad, doesn't make it wrong, doesn't make it, we need to not read it because it's not factual. It's meant to tell a story. So, anyway, where was I? So that he may resist the various agitations, since he can resist with divine help. God gives us the graces, which always remain with him, though he does not clearly feel it. That's us, we may not clearly feel it, for the Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, leaving him, however, sufficient grace for eternal salvation. Okay, so God gives us the graces that we need. We just have to cooperate with the graces that he gives us, and we are so bad at cooperating with God and my wife and whoever it happens to be, because most of the time my wife is right, I just didn't listen, so, but that's okay. That's okay. That's where humility comes in, and we go from there. So yeah, God will sometimes, on purpose, leave us in desolation or allow us to be in desolation because he wants to invoke some sort of a change. He wants us to be jolted. And this again too is hard to discern for ourselves. Take it to somebody else that you know that is a very good spiritual person. If you don't have a spiritual director, talk to a good friend, talk it out. Like St. Paul says, don't do this yourself. Take it to somebody else. Take it to a group. If this other person is not helping you, take it to the church, and eventually you'll get the answer. Okay. Probably not something we'll spend a lot of time in confession in, because I always wonder when I get behind religious sisters why they're spending so long in confession. What am I doing wrong that my confession is so short? And I'm sure they're confessing venial sins that I'm still up in this mortal sin realm of things. But anyway, okay. Rule the eighth. We won't do this example. Servant God Elizabeth was stirred. This is the one. Just a real interesting story, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, take care, Doc.
You guys.
Thanks for stopping. I believe, maybe you're wrong, but I think this is the lady that was, her husband wasn't Catholic, she was, she wrote a diary, her husband never saw the diary, didn't understand, why she was doing what she's doing. When she died, he read the diary, and it was just like mind-blowing to him. I know people like that have a spouse that just doesn't understand the other spouse, and you wonder if there's going to be a revelation somewhere down the line. But anyway, let's look at what Rule 8 is telling us here. Let one who is in desolation work to be in patience, which is contrary to the vexations which come to him, and let him think that he will soon be consoled, diligently using the means against such desolation as is said in the 6th rule. Just to point out again, what time frame is Ignatius writing this in?
16th century.
Yeah. Chivalry, yeomen, whatever. So a lot of this is in, but a lot of writings are in the male, if you will. But and later on, you'll see some examples that St. Ignatius gives that are just kind of like, any women would just go, what in the world are you talking about? But so anyway, let the one in desolation work to be impatient. Impatience. Don't be Job. The patience of Job we hear all the time. Don't force it. Just kind of listen to God. Listen to your spiritual director. Listen to that good spiritual friend, because we know that our spiritual life is not this. We know it's not this, and we should know it's not this. It's kind of like this, right? So if we're up here, we should remember at some point we're going to be down here. And when we're down here, we want to remember that time we were up here because we're going to get back to it. So in that time of desolation down here, remember those times you were in consolation. Remember that feeling. Remember what you did the last time you were in desolation to get there. Maybe that applies. Maybe that's how you want to move on. Okay? So don't get discouraged. Be patient. Work it out. Okay? Rule the ninth. Let's see if we're reading that. Yeah, let's read this thing. I'll read the St. Ignatius story. Later, at another time, when much consoled, I thought I was satisfied. That is, I thought that it was better not to be consoled by God our Lord if the lack of his visitation was due to my not having disposed myself or helped myself throughout the day. Again, he's not blaming him. He's not blaming God, he's blaming himself. Or in giving place to some thoughts that distracted me from his words in the sacrifice, which is the Mass, and from his divine majesty. And so I thought it would be better not to be consoled in the time of my faults, and that God our Lord orders this, who loves me more than I love myself, for my greater spiritual benefit, so that it is better for me to walk straight, not only in the sacrifice, but throughout the day, in order to be visited. So, again, St. Ignatius here is realizing that God is not in the desolation. God is allowing the desolation. And if he stays true to his path, God will pull him out of the desolation through his graces. So, rule the ninth, there are three principal causes for which we find ourselves desolate. The first is because we are tepid, slothful, or negligent in our spiritual exercises. How many of us have been there? God will point that out to us. Hey, you're not doing what you said you were going to do. This is the 10th day in a row now. What's going on? Let's do something. So do our false spiritual consolation withdraws from us. The second, to try us and see how much we are and how much we extend ourselves in his service and praise without so much payment of consolation and increased graces. So what we're saying here is that, hey, don't forget, I am God, you are not, and you are here for my glory. We are here on this earth for the glory of God. Sometimes we forget that, we get a little prideful, and God needs to give us a little bit of humility, show us a little bit of humility. Third, to give us true recognition and understanding that we may interiorly feel that it is not ours to attain or maintain increased devotion, intense love, tears, or any spiritual consolation, but that all is a gift and grace of God our Lord, and so that we may not build a nest in something belonging to another, raising our mind in some pride or vainglory, attributing to ourselves the devotion or the other parts of the spiritual consolation. I think back to that image of the ecstasy with St. Teresa of Avila. God has pierced her. And then God says, that's enough. And we want more. We just want it when we're in those moments. We just want more. But God is saying, no, I'm giving you a taste. And he can give us a taste. Typically when we're in mortal sin, which is how we fall out of sanctifying grace, that's the only thing that can take away sanctifying grace is mortal sin. Venial sin doesn't, imperfections don't, temptations don't. But God may give us, even when we're in mortal sin, a taste of, hey, here's what you're missing, And he's probably going to pull that back right away. And if you've ever had those moments, they're profound, absolutely profound. But we got to realize that, and God wants us to realize that, hey, this isn't you, this is me doing this. So don't forget that. Anybody relate to that? Yeah. Good. You're all good, holy people here in Nicodemus Club. All right. So, why does a God who loves us and whom we are seeking to love, permit us to experience the heaviness of spiritual desolation. So God permits spiritual desolation to heal us from areas of regression in our spiritual life. That was the first cause, to provide opportunities for growth. That's the second cause. And protect from a pitfall. That is the third cause. And we're about to be hit with a bus. God holds us back. There is in your handout, by the way, a brief summary of, kind of a summary page of the a summary page of the 14 rules and kind of a quick way to look at it. Let's see. Yeah, an antidote to the spiritual chaos. That, and then the separate text of the rules. But here it just kind of gives you a just kind of a summary. You have on one short sheet of paper. Why does God, who loves us, allow us to experience spiritual desolation? And then it talks about that summary there. So just a good quick way to go through that. And while I'm up this way, I'm going to mention a couple of books that I think are really, really helpful. This is a book, Timothy Gallagher, The Discernment of Spirits, an Ignatian Guide for Everyday Life. Has anybody ever heard of the permutive, illuminative, and unitive ways? St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. There's the 3 stages kind of the interior life, which is another great set of books. Anybody know Father Michael Hendershot?
Yeah.
From Holy Ghost. If you ever have a chance to go to confession at Holy Ghost, and Thursday nights, Father Hendershot is usually there. Young priest, but just fabulous in the confession. Fabulous. And he asked me one time after I got done with confession, he said, "Do you like to read?" And I said, "Love to read." He said, and he made a mention that this was not penance, thankfully. He said, "Have you ever read the 3 Ages of the Interior Life?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And then he said, "Yeah, I would suggest reading that." And I said, "It's not a penance, right?" He said, No, this is your penance." I said, "Okay." But that's before I even knew that this was a 2-volume set, 650 pages long. So, yeah, in the class that I'm taking right now, spiritual theology, I always get scared when the teacher says, "Oh, and for additional reading, St. Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica." Like, that's suggested additional reading. But this book ended up being, it's amazing how God works, because in that class, this was one of the books he suggested. And it's fabulous. Fabulous. So, anyway, but Discernment of Spirits. Father Timothy Gallagher has a podcast called, it's a whole set called Discerning Hearts. You look it up in your iPhone or Android or whatever, Discerning Hearts, and that'll come up. And the spiritual, the rules, he goes through the rules on there. He's got a lot of other fabulous speakers. I would hesitate, though, and I'll say it right now, you'll see something called the second set of rules. Have you ever heard of the second set of rules? Good, ignore them. Don't go anywhere near those without a spiritual director. It is not for the general public. Why he even puts it up there, but it's there. A great book. If you wanted to summarize a little bit easier, does anybody know Dan Burke? Ever heard of Dan Burke? He was the president. I think he may still be the president of the National Catholic Register. So two good news sources: the Register and the Catholic News Agency. National Catholic Reporter, stay away from it. National Catholic Register, very good. But Dan Burke runs a thing called the Avila Institute, and so I'm taking a lot of courses there, a lot of good short courses there. Discernment of Spirits is great. Navigating the Interior Life is another one. I think all these are on one of the last pages of your handout. If not, you can come write them down. So he also summarizes Teresa of Avila's The Interior Castle, The Devil in the Castle. He also has a podcast on that, which is great. And then Brant Petrie, you know Dr. Brant Petrie, he does a good job just kind of summarizing everything. There's a lot of stuff in here, but it's very, very low-level stuff, so it's a good read. So anyway, While I was walking over that way, I figured I'd throw that out. So this is kind of a summary of Rule the 9. And all right, so Rule 10, let the one who is in consolation think how he will conduct himself in the desolation, which will come after, taking new strength for that time. And we see which will come after, the consolation that will come after the desolation. So we're on that curve. We're just somewhere on that curve, and we've got to think about not to get bogged down in the desolation. How am I going to get? What did I do the last time? We've been through this before. I've been down before. I can do this again. I can get back up. And so we've always got to be thinking about what am I going to do to get myself into contact. How am I going to act? I'm going to look forward to this time. When I'm going on this trip, I'm feeling down, but I know I got a trip coming up. What am I going to do on this trip? And sometimes it takes your mind off the desolation that you're in a moment. It's a physical thing, but it's something that gets us up, that helps us through these bad times. And we all have these things, whether it's a friend to talk to, whatever it happens to be, but just use that time in desolation to remember that, hey, there was a time when I was in consolation, and what am I going to do when I get there? Make sense? Absolutely makes sense. Any questions at this point?
Deacon?
Yeah.
Is that going back to that operating? Is that like when a lot of abuses, a lot of people leave the church because what I'm offering to say, I received communion from a priest, and they act like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Is it this? That's
Yeah. That's something we got to remember, right? Don't be holier than the church. The church is made up of people. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to be bad people. They're even bad folks. But we've got a lot of people that jump away into things like the Society of St. Pius X, right? The SSPX. They're in schism. That's not. Don't ever be holier than the church. It's one thing we learned in deacon classes. Don't ever be holier than the church. The sacraments work because of the works themselves, because of Jesus Christ is the one that is ministering the sacraments. No matter how bad the priest is, for us, they work. We have to cooperate with the graces that we're getting in that, and that's the thing to remember. So the church is still the church. And it's a good point. It's a good point. Pretty good. All right. So there's examples there, which we won't go through. Kind of losing my voice a little bit, but that's okay. All right, Rule 11. Let one who is consoled seek to humble himself and lower himself as much as he can, thinking of how little he is capable in the time of desolation without such grace or consolation. On the contrary, let one who is in desolation think that he can do much with God's sufficient grace to resist all his enemies, taking strength in his Creator and Lord. Humility, humility, humility is kind of the theme of Rule the 11. So never forget that whatever has got you in consolation is from God. It is not from us. It's not from somebody else. That everything comes from God. It's by God's grace, and by God's grace alone. So if we always remember that, and we'll get into the examine and what to do in an examine. Perfect prayer. What's the perfect prayer?
Our Father.
Our Father. Yeah, it's the words that Jesus taught us. It's great to have words get misused all over the place. I'm going to say ejaculatory prayer. Okay, and that is prayer that comes from the heart. Our Protestant friends are really good at that. We maybe not so good at that. But it's just prayer, but it tends to be individual, right? It's not something that we can all, as a community, pray. Because when Jesus says retreat to your inner room, he's talking about in here. He's not talking about physical space, although it could be. But we have certain prayers in the church because Jesus gave us the perfect prayer. And when we don't know what else to say, sometimes we have those prayers to go back to. I've got here, I could bless stuff. I got a small book of blessings here. And why should I create my own words when the church has given me perfect words to use that I know are going to be effective ex opere operato in that sense? So even the perfect prayer starts out with what? Our Father who art in heaven. Recognition of who it is we are praying to. So the same in Rule the 11th, in consolation, recognize why we are there. In desolation, recognize why we are there. It is because of God the Father either giving it to us or allowing it. Nothing bad will ever come from our Heavenly Father. So even the perfect prayer starts out with that thanks. So being thankful is always one of the things, and when we get to the examine prayer, and reviewing our day, and reviewing our moments in the day, how important being thankful is. Okay, make sense? Oh, this one makes sense. Oh, yeah, this is kind of cool. On page 9, just a kind of little thing that's not summarized on your other sheet, but it's something to take and read. Ways of taking new strength when in consolation. Prayer, petition for strength in future spiritual desolations. Meditation on truths that will sustain us while we're in desolation. Consideration of the value of spiritual desolation for our growth. God has a purpose for everything. If a young child dies at birth, a mother who has lost several sons in the same year, things like that are real. They're real. And we just don't see, how do you see something from God in that? How do you see God's plan in that? Sometimes we just sit there and we ask, why? But we also have to ask, what, Lord, do you want me to do with this? I know you didn't cause this. You allowed it, but there's a reason that you allowed it. Help me to see the reason that you allowed this. I may not see it for years. Whenever one of the questions we had on our application for the Deacon program was, do you get answers in your prayers? And I can honestly say back then, no, I don't. Right away. And maybe 3 months. Have you ever had that experience where you prayed for something and then you just, as a passing thing, and then months later, you get this answer and you go, wow, I was praying for that 3 months ago. It just wasn't my time, it was God's time. So we still pray. Always pray for the dead. Because
You never know.
yeah, God's outside of our time. God knew today that I was going to be praying for some person. He knew at the beginning of time that I was going to pray on January the 15th for somebody to die on January the 10th. And he can apply those prayers anytime that he wants to apply them. That's his thing. We never give up praying. Right? Father Padre Pio prayed for his dad to go to heaven for 50 years, to be in heaven. And finally he got a vision from Mary that said, whatever his real name was, Padre Pio, you can stop praying for your father now, he is in heaven. Okay? So don't ever give up. Don't let anybody give up. Tell them to keep praying. It's God's time. Okay? All right. So, anyway, some other things you can look at there on page 9, some things to consider. All right. Let's see. It's 11. Example here, which we'll do. All right. So 12 and 14 are kind of a separate set of rules and things to do specifically within the spiritual life when you have a particular situation. And some of these you're going to look at and go, what a chauvinist. But anyway, take it for what it's worth. So rule 12, we'll talk about, St. Ignatius talks about a woman fighting with a man, which never happened. Rule the 13th, a false lover seeking to use another. And that's, like I said, is going to be, along with rule 5, the 2 rules to just always remember. And third, the leader of a group of thieves desiring to sack and pillage. We'll talk about our weak points and how the devil attacks those weak points. That's really what rule 14 is about. We all have weak points. We know what they are. We need to work on the weak points, but that's where we're going to be attacked. Michael Jordan was terrible at defense. And he would spend 3 times as much time practicing defense than he did his offense. And people would see him doing this. Why are you doing that? You're such a great shooter. Why don't you? He said, because that's where I'm weak. And if I'm going to be attacked, that's where I'm weak, and I need to work on that. I'm confident in this, and I can not spend so much time here, but I need to spend more time here. And sometimes we need the help of a good spiritual director, a good friend. And we don't recognize the faults in ourselves, right? Most of the time. My wife points out faults in me that I know I didn't. For sure I didn't have, but apparently I do. And so I go, okay, and if I pray it and take it to prayer, I go, okay, you're probably right. Let me work on that. And it's a humble act. But that's why we don't do things in private. It's personal but not private. So always ask somebody, is there something that I do that bugs you? Because only a true friend is going to tell you for sure. It's always good to have that good friend that's just going to tell you like it is, and not somebody that's just going to agree with you because they want to agree with you and be a good friend and think that they're your friend by agreeing with you. And that's another reason I'm not on social media. I just don't. I may get back there sometime. But, there's several reasons why I don't do Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever they are. But yeah. Anyway. So let's look at these rules, 12 to 14. All right, so rule 12. The enemy acts like a woman in being weak when faced with strength, and strong when faced with weakness. For as it is proper to a woman when she is fighting with some man to lose heart and to flee when the man confronts her firmly. And on the contrary, if the man begins to flee, losing heart, the anger, vengeance, and ferocity of the woman grow greatly and know no bounds. In the same way, it is proper to the enemy to weaken and lose heart. So here's where the analogy is, and whether it was a good analogy or not. Okay. So in the same way, it is proper to the enemy to weaken and lose heart, fleeing and ceasing his temptations when the person who is exercising himself in spiritual things confronts the temptations of the enemy firmly, doing what is diametrically opposed to them. And I don't know why he goes back to himself when talking about a woman, but that's fine. And on the contrary, if the person who is exercising himself begins to be afraid and lose heart in suffering the temptations, there is no beast so fierce on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature in following out his damnable intention with such growing malice. Get it?
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense? Anybody give me a different example? Sometimes what do they tell you to do when a bear is coming at you?
Run like hell.
Well, not run a bear, but run faster than the person that's with you. It's
Yeah.
probably the thing to do. So, yeah, I don't run unless I'm being paid anymore. I was telling them I was an NCAA referee and got paid fairly well to do it, and paid fairly well to run. But if you see me now running, I'm being chased by somebody. It's not on purpose, so pick me up, please. But yeah, I just tell people I had knee replacement, but I can at least outrun enough people to where I'm not going to get eaten by the lion or whatever it is. But yeah, make yourself big, make yourself fierce. Sometimes they say. I mean, only other option you got, right? If you cower, then you're going to get eaten. But I've heard it said that if you make yourself bigger, that they have a tendency to see you as a threat. And they don't necessarily want to eat you, I don't think. But yeah, so that's kind of what we're saying here is that if you feel like you're being attacked, but it does depend on the vice, right? I mean, there's some you want to flee from, and by fleeing, you really make the devil mad in those instances of lust, for instance, of gluttony, for instance, of what else? Anger. Maybe flee from anger. Just get out of it. Don't let it consume you. And that makes people mad, right? I mean, you know, on Facebook, when you don't answer somebody's post, that you know, they posted a response to what you posted, and it was just like so negative, so bad, and you just don't respond. I mean, doesn't that make people mad? Sometimes, you know, when they want a response, they want to get something out of me, you just don't play the game. I'm not playing there.
I always figured the counter argument was so devastating that you just couldn't do anything.
That's probably what it is, Gene. That's probably what it is. You've blown them away with your counter argument. Yeah. So no arguments are ever won on social media. You've not converted anybody's hearts, and I can't get some of our deacons in particular to understand that you're not going to win that argument there. Invite them out to dinner. Invite them out to lunch. Let's talk about this. Find out you have more common ground than you have negative ground. You know, that was one of my homilies. It's just dinner. It's just lunch. You know, just go out and have lunch. We don't even have to talk about the issue. Just talk. You know, just find common ground. When I did prison ministry, that was the thing that we always preached to them. Find common ground. You know, don't sit there and argue about things that you already know you're not going to convince them. They're not going to convince you. You're never going to out-convince the devil, for sure. And so don't try to argue. Don't play in that. It's dangerous to play in the devil's backyard. Get out of their backyard. That really makes them mad. Yeah. Makes sense. And sometimes I think it's another example of a dog, maybe. You know, a dog, sometimes you can get to flee if you show that you're not afraid of the dog. I don't know. I'm afraid of the dog. I did a great example here in Rule 12 with a seminarian, and that was that had the temptation to smoke and had the temptation to do other things. It just eventually took him out of the seminary. But yeah, some things we want to fight. Sometimes things we need to fight. All right, here's the big one. Rule of 13. Again, along with Rule 5, is probably the most important. And I do want to start here by reading the story here from, we got time, I want to read the whole thing. Okay? I want to read the whole thing. Beautiful story. And this is where a good spiritual director really is important. A good friend is really important. All right? So this is before she professed her final vows. The beautiful day of my wedding, final vows, finally arrived. It was without a single cloud. However, the preceding evening, a storm arose in my soul. So are we talking spiritual or physical here? Spiritual, yeah. The like of which I'd never seen before. Not a single doubt concerning my vocation had ever entered my mind until then. And it evidently was necessary that I experience this trial. In the evening, while making the way of the cross after matins, that's evening prayer, that's actually night prayer, my vocation appeared to me as a dream, a chimera. I found life in Carmel to be very beautiful, but the devil inspired me with the assurance that it wasn't for me and that I was misleading my superiors by advancing on this way to which I wasn't called. The darkness was so great that I could understand one thing only. I didn't have a vocation. How can I possibly describe the anguish in my soul? Has anybody ever read Teresa Lisieux and know her story on getting into how difficult it was at her age and getting approval from even the Pope to get into? Beautiful story. What's the name of the book? St. Teresa Lisieux's Story of the Soul. Yeah, great. On Hallow, it may still be available. There's a podcast series which goes through that. So if you want to listen to it, it's great. So it appeared to me, and this is absurdity, which shows this is an absurdity which showed it was a temptation from the devil. So she's recognizing that. Be aware, right? First, be aware and understand that if I were to tell my novice mistress about these fears, she would prevent me from pronouncing my vows. And still, I wanted to do God's will and return to the world rather than remain in Carmel and do my will on my own. I made the novice mistress come out of the choir, that's where they do their prayers, and filled with confusion, I told her the state of my soul. Fortunately, she saw things much clearer than I did, and she completely reassured me. The act of humility I just performed put the devil to flight, since he had perhaps thought I would not dare admit my temptation. My doubts left me completely as soon as I finished speaking. My doubts left me completely as soon as I finished speaking. Nevertheless, to make my act of humility even more perfect, I still wish to confide my strange temptation to our mother Prius, who simply laughed at me. Can you imagine that? Poor thing. In the morning on September 8th, I felt as though I was flooded with a river of peace, and it was in this peace which surpasses all understanding that I pronounced my holy vows. So, to read Rule the 13th and to see quickly how all this applies and applied in that situation. Likewise, he conducts himself as a false lover. This is the evil spirit. Conducts himself as a false lover and wishing to remain secret and not to be revealed. For a dissolute man who, speaking with evil intention, makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father or a wife of a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be secret. I mean, who wants to publish an affair, right? And the contrary displeases him very much. When the daughter reveals to her father or the wife to her husband his false words and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. In the same way, when the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. But when one reveals them to one's good confessor or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have been revealed. Pretty profound, right? Don't leave it to yourself. Don't leave it to yourself. Some things are so hard to tell to another person. That's why you have to have that confidant that's going to listen to you and understand what's going on. Saint Therese had made her profession. She was in full consolation whenever she entered the convent and decided to enter the convent. There was no doubt when the sisters finally accepted her, they knew that she was ready. My son Bobby, I knew he wasn't ready to go in the seminary right out of high school. And I told the priest, he's not ready. The vocations director, he's not ready. He said, yeah, he's ready, he's ready. Bobby had such a profound experience of wanting to do God's will and heard the call. I think he deep down didn't think it was the time, it was the right time. But the call was there since second grade. Okay, so this was a strong call in Bobby. After about 3 months, maybe 2 months, in Indiana, in minor seminary, and in Indianapolis, he sends me a note. I call him. He said, I just don't think I'm ready. I don't think I'm ready. And I said, do you think you still have a vocation? He said, maybe, but I'm just not ready. I said, what if I go through and get a degree in philosophy and discern out, now what am I going to do with a philosophy degree? Okay, I said, okay, I get it. So he came out, went and got his teaching certificate, got his elementary teaching certificate. Always sensed that there was a good vocation there. He tried dating, didn't work out well. His heart wasn't in that. I always knew his heart was where God wanted him to be. He told his first girlfriend when he was in high school, she was so confused as to why he wanted to go to seminary. And he told her in front of all of us, said, I am hearing this as God's will, and I cannot not do God's will. She was devastated. know. But so when he came out of seminary, I could tell he was in desolation. He was in definite desolation. And after a couple of years, we're sitting talking at a restaurant, and I'm talking about some genetic, physical things that were going on in my life. And you just kind of let him know, hey, this is something you might want to look for when you get older. By the way, anybody that's ever had prostate cancer, if you know anybody that's had prostate cancer, needs somebody to talk to, I will talk, because men, I know men like to share their problems, and we just like to put our head on other men's shoulders and cry, but of course we don't. But again, I have talked to many people about my experience, which is probably going to be different. But so anyway, I'm telling my son all this, and he says, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to have to worry about that." And I got a big smile on my face. I said, "You're thinking about going back, aren't you?" He said, "Yeah, I really think I'm going to go back." So he talked to the bishop, got back in, finished his philosophy degree, and now he's got 3.5 years before ordination. But it's funny how God works in those ways, right? But it took knowing. If somebody did not know the history and the fact that he was in pure consolation, undoubted consolation at the time he made that decision the first time, somebody may have advised him, "No, I don't think so. I think you discerned out," and so anyway, that's the application of that rule. He and I talked, and I know he talked to spiritual directors about it, and so that's the proper use of this rule of 13. So if you ever feel like you're being talked out of something, that you were in consolation when you decided to do that, and everything was going great, take the time to tell somebody. So again, rule 5, when in desolation, don't ever make a change. And rule 13, you got a problem spiritually, tell somebody. Okay? Somebody that you trust. Make sense? Yep. We're good. All right. So the tactic of the enemy is to keep the burden secret. I think this is summarized on that one sheet. Know whether it's spiritual versus non-spiritual. And with whom should we speak? Again, spiritual directors are hard to come by, but you got friends, you got people that good prayerful people. Find a good friend. Always have that good friend that's not going to lie to you. That's not going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going through all this and talking about spiritual versus non-spiritual, and I've talked previously about tying the two together. My favorite thing to do, one of my favorite things to do, is to pray the rosary on a long walk, and so to tie those two things together, because for me, I get so much more out of tying some physical activity to my spiritual activity. Just get so much out of it. And I've had some profound moments on long walks, praying the rosary, and just having these intense visions of a person that I know was going through a difficult time, and praying on the sorrowful mysteries, all of a sudden being able to see this person on the cross, this person in the garden, this person being scourged, this person having the crown of thorns, this person carrying the cross. It was just a profound moment that was just pure gift from God. Very rare, but sometimes it helps me relax my mind so that I don't have a whole lot and I'm just focused on the prayer. And anyway, just a suggestion, kind of a cool thing to do. All right. So we talked about Saint Therese of Lisieux, for example. Some of the things you can do to help. Again, confession. Confession is one that you would say, Father, can I talk to you about this later? Because really, confession, all we're supposed to do is what? Number in kind. It's not a, if you're going to the same confessor, I highly encourage going to the same confessor, because they'll, even though they're not supposed to remember, they know you and they start to see patterns, and suggest things to you. The one thing I love about Father Hendershot, his penances are on point. It's not, I'm not going to say three fathers and three Hail Marys. They are on point. He is listening, and gives you something. I don't like a confessor that tells me, what do you think you should do for your penance? And you never go to a confessor and say, well, I don't think that's a good enough penance. Can I do this instead? And you just don't ever do that. It's a bad thing to do. Okay? But, you know, I mean, dig yourself into the spiritual life. Read books. Discuss with people books. Try to set up small groups where you're reading the book in a group and talking about these things. Retreats are great. There's lots of monasteries around here that have weekend retreats where you just get away. You know, I don't know if you heard the story about Deacon David Lucian lost his voice on a silent retreat. He went on a retreat, I think it was Kentucky maybe, with his wife Christine. And yeah, he lost his voice on a silent retreat.
Bob, not to make a point, but you ran out of time 15 minutes ago.
Oh, I did?
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought we went to 11:15.
Nope, quarter of.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
We started at 9:15.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
90 minutes.
Okay, all right, well, I ran out of time. I'm sorry if I did that.
Very
You
good.
can read the rest. Look in particular at the examen. That's one thing I want you to look at is the examen. And start doing that. It's very important to know thyself. That's what the overriding thing is, know thyself. Okay, very good. Again, I apologize for going over, but
It's worth it.
thank you.